This next talk is entitled iRODS HTTP API version 0.3.0 with OpenID Connect. And this is going to be given by myself and Martin Flores. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so I'm not going to stand up here and take a lot of your time. I'm going to try to get through this as quick as possible so that I can hand the mic to Martin so that he can talk about the really cool things that he's been working on with the HTTP API. So let's talk about what's happened with the HTTP API since last UGM. Last year, we pretty much just introduced the HTTP API. We did not have a release, but since then, we've now put out 3 releases, those being 0.1.0, 0.2.0, and 0.3.0. 0.1.0 was pretty much just the baseline release. This was just like, let's get it out there. Let's see what happens. Let's put it in people's hands and see what they say. During 0.1.0, we closed 88 issues, 10 of those being bugs, 57 enhancements. For 0.2.0, we closed 57 issues, 11 bugs, 25 enhancements. The 0.2.0 was really the first release where people actually started getting their hands on the HTTP API and actually attempting to use it and pointing out issues, whether it was with executing various operations or attempting to use OpenID Connect. So what we did with that release, we simply, based on 0.1.0 information as well as other comments, we simplified the OpenID Connect configuration. We improved separation between the HTTP status codes as well as the iRODS status codes. This is primarily about when you make, since the HTTP API is mostly a presentation layer to iRODS, there's 2 sides of it, right? There's the HTTP communication component, and then on the back end, there's the iRODS communication component. And so we provided a clear separation between those two. So when errors do occur, you will know exactly at what point the error occurred. We focused on improving API documentation by marking various parameters on the API as optional. We also marked the defaults for all parameters. And we also focused on improving the API usability by constraining the input requirements, right? And so if you've ever used the C and the C++ interface, you know that these APIs are very low level and they allow you to practically almost do anything in iRODS. So we wanted to put some guardrails around that for the HTTP API. And by doing that, for free, we get some stability, but we also focus on improving stability by adjusting issues by adjusting the implementation, right? Especially as we learn more and more about Boost Beast, which is the underlying HTTP API which is the HTTP library driving the HTTP API. Last but not least, with 0.2.0, we included configuration validation on server startup. This means that when you give your HTTP API bad configuration, it will validate using its default internal schema. And if there's an issue, it will reject it and not start. And so that gives you immediate feedback on whether you did something wrong and you need to adjust, and whether you need to adjust something. This also proved to be very useful in that because HTTP API ships with a default JSON schema, you can also, there's options to tell the HTTP API to dump that schema so that you can tweak it in case we actually introduced a bug in the schema configuration. And so then you can feed that updated schema back into the HTTP API and launch it with that schema so that you can make progress. For 0.3.0, we closed 6 issues. In my mind, this is primarily the OpenID Connect release because this is the one that contained the most OpenID Connect changes as far as significance. Here we fixed 1 bug, and also we resolved 4 enhancements. This right here, in this release, we added protected resource mode, which Martin is going to discuss next. And we put a little bit of effort into improving support for TLS between HTTP API and the iRODS server. So with that, I'm now going to hand the mic to Martin, and he's going to talk to you about all the nice things that he's done with the HTTP API.
All right. So without further ado, let's go straight into all the new items regarding OAuth and OIDC in HTTP API 0.3.0. So if I had to sum it up, there are essentially three major features. Two of them are supporting features. One of them, I believe, is the real meat and bones of this change. So starting with the more supportive features, we have confidential client support now available to us. There's also an alternate user mapping that's provided within the HTTP API itself. I'm going to quickly go over these, not too much detail. We'll talk about it more later. And the real meat and bones is the protected resource mode support for the HTTP API. I believe that's going to be the biggest feature that will help in application development on top of the HTTP API. If you played around with 0.1.0 or 0.2.0, especially in regards to OAuth, you might have encountered some issues. This should essentially remove those issues. At the very least, it's what happened to me when I was running a sample application on top of it. So there's a link to the PR if you are curious about that. In that PR link, there is a short summary of the three major features listed here. Very nice to read, as well as a whole bunch of discussion. If you're curious about that, you can definitely check that out. But without further ado, let's go straight into the client authentication portion, confidential client. So basically, we support OAuth 2.0 client authentication for our initial implementation or our first pass, I suppose. We only support password-based authentication. So making it clear we are aware there are alternate methods or modes of authentication, but since this was the simplest path forward, as well as helps us develop the rest of the features faster, this is the path I chose. This feature is supported in both client and protected resource mode. To clarify, client is basically the only mode that was available to you in 0.1.0 and 0.2.0, and in 0.3.0, we now have protected resource. So onto the alternate user mapping. Previously, the two previous versions mentioned, 0.1.0 and 0.2.0, it required you to have some sort of administrative access to an OpenID provider and then essentially directly map an OpenID Connect user to an actual iRODS user. This wasn't ideal for some people. Maybe you might not have access to it or alternate reasons. So with 0.3.0, we now provide a way for you to provide a mapping of an OpenID Connect user within the HTTP API configuration file. Very nice. Let me see. Yeah, let's go straight to the example of it. So within the OpenID Connect stanza, assuming you're already familiar with the configuration, pardon, you basically have a new user attribute mapping, somewhere up there. And you essentially map iRODS users. So in this case, if you're looking at the example over there, see Rods Bob and Rods Alice. And those are the iRODS users. We then effectively look at these other attributes. For example, if we were to look at Rods Bob, no, darn, I had a cool little animation thing that focuses it. Okay, so if you look at Rods Bob, you can see there's an email, subject identifier, as well as a phone number. So what this effectively means is that when we're mapping an OpenID Connect user to an iRODS user, these three attributes for Rods Bob must match. Otherwise, the user doesn't get mapped to Rods Bob and they aren't authenticated as them. Same for Rods Alice, except this time they only have two attributes. I just did this to highlight you can have an arbitrary number of attributes per iRODS user. Reasoning for this, we'll go into a little bit following afterwards. Yeah, effectively, this is how you do the alternate mapping. You put the users on the left up there, as well as the desired attributes following after or inside the block. So one thing or something to take note is that we get our data from different sources depending on the mode you're in. So alternate user mapping does work in both protected resource mode as well as the client mode of the HPA API. In protected resource mode, we do get our data via the introspection endpoint. That's a OAuth 2.0 feature. And in client mode, we get it directly from the OpenID Connect ID token. So it is pretty important to note that the information that you receive is highly dependent on the OpenID provider's configuration. So you do want to query these endpoints or look at the tokens that you have just to make sure what information is available for you to map. If we're to take an example of the introspection endpoint, this example is taken straight from the documentation. So you might see more if you have an OpenID provider or OpenID server. I know I did when I took a look at it. But effectively, the only thing that is guaranteed here by the specification is line number 2, whether or not an access token is valid. That isn't to say you can't get any more information. It just means you need to take a look into your configuration to make sure you actually do have information available to map. So very important. Right. So now on to protected resource mode. So what is so special about this? It effectively removes the HPA API from like the entire OAuth authentication flows. Whereas previously you needed to effectively provide your credentials through the HPA API or do a awkward dance, OAuth dance to redirect over to the OpenID provider and then redirect back to the HPA API. You no longer need to do that. As a matter of fact, the only thing in this mode that it receives is an access token. This does mean the code executed in the HTTP API is much more simpler, as well as if you're building an application on top of the HTTP API, it is a much smoother experience to actually integrate it into your overall system. Again, this has to do with the way that the OAuth flow works. If you played around with 0.0, 0.2.0, definitely play around with this, you'll see for sure. But yeah, once again, so implementation detail. For protected resource mode to work, we do need an access token, as stated. And there are multiple methods to actually validate and get information from an access token. The one that we currently chose to implement was introspection endpoint. We are aware of offline validation. That is something that we are looking into, but we'll get to that towards the end. So if you're to look up there, effectively, communication elements like 1 through 4, previously that all effectively needed to go through the iRODS HTTP API, which is on that side. But now that is no longer the case. The API consumer, which is effectively whoever's building on top of the API, now can go directly to the OpenID provider. Some might find this to be a hassle, but it effectively allows you to use the HTTP API in a much simpler manner, as now you just need to pass in, as you see in line 5, an access token. And the HTTP API, all it does at this point is just query the OpenID provider using the introspection endpoint to then determine whether or not the access token is valid. And internally, once it receives a response and it is valid, it then does the mapping of the user. So it's very nice. Okay, so with that part done, I will point out the draft specifications of interest. OAuth 2.0 has a security best practices draft. There are several interesting elements in there that are worth addressing. Some of the more impactful ones are probably the discouraging of the use of the resource owner password credential grant. Reason why it's so important is because this is already within the HTTP API. So if you are relying on it, you may be affected because it's highly suggested to not use it. Reasoning in the draft, of course. Highly recommend you read it. So in the OAuth 2.1 draft, it's also removed, and they point you back to the 2.0 security best practices draft. Also, some other changes in there. Can't think off the top of my head, but let's see. Some other points of interest, references to all the OAuth, OpenID Connect items, as well as token introspection. Some other items of interest are just in regards to handling of JWTs. I forget full word off the top of my head for some reason. But yeah, all of that are in the draft specifications. That's like second to last as well as third from last items. Highly recommend checking those out. Those ones are the latest specifications at the time of making the slides, so you could just go to those directly. But yeah, it's very nice. So gonna head back to Kory now, I believe.
There's more. All right, so thanks, Martin. So for future work, we have, I guess you could say, 3 levels or 2 levels and some considerations about what we want to focus on moving forward with the HTTP API, or at least the next couple releases, right? One of the top items that we want to address is how to make the write operation more web friendly. Right now, the HTTP is modeled to is designed to model the actual C interface for iRODS with a lot of extra hand holding to make things simple. And so while this is great for people who are used to POSIX and how to stream and buffer data, it's not so great for web applications. And so we want to make that more web friendly moving forward. And so that would require having to go back and consider how we want to expose that information, because making it more web friendly doesn't necessarily mean we want to remove the existing write capabilities. Those things we want to keep for people interested in uh, having more control over the behavior of their web applications. We also, one of the things that is missing with the HTTP API is how to distinguish users within the log file. Right now, we don't track IP addresses, but that means we also don't have any information in the log file to separate what messages are related to a particular request or operation. And so we want to address that by either including the IP address or providing some combination of user identifying information, right, to make it easier for administrators. We may even go a step further and change the log output to be JSON, just like the iRODS server, so that people can actually parse the log messages coming through the HTTP API. As for medium priority items, we want to, as Martin pointed out, the user mapping has to be defined within the configuration file. So if you have 10,000 users, obviously we can see that that's not great for maintenance or for maintaining the actual user mapping. And so we want to look into possibly externalizing that, maybe through plugins, or just moving it into a separate file altogether. You know, the way about going about that is, we have to think about it. We don't know which way forward is the right answer just yet. We also want to, because 4.3.2 is released and it's absorbed the jQuery 2 API, we want to also update the HTTP API to leverage the new absorbed version of jQuery 2. Maybe even, it's also an option that we could consider supporting the external repo. We don't know if we want to do that just yet. Probably unlikely, but it's a consideration that we want to think about. And then another thing here is that we want to implement any missing iRODS APIs that make sense to exist in the HTTP API. So we want to continue to go through and fill out the missing operations there. As far as things that we are considering, it's been brought to our attention that, when you issue transfers within the HTTP API, you don't really have a way to cancel them or track their status. So if you start a transfer and then maybe you lose that connection, it would be nice maybe to have some way to query the HTTP API to see what is actively happening within it, right? We also want to consider extending the lifetime of basic authentication tokens on use, right? So just like in any normal web application, there's a session a lot of times attached to what the user is doing, right? And this thing can time out and whatnot, but any interactions with the server will generally like bump the session timeout, right? And so we want to think about how to maybe support that. And of course, we always want to look into improving documentation around the API. We want this thing to be easy for people to hold and read and get up to speed on. And so perhaps we look into tools for generating API documentation. We know that OpenAPI is working on a brand new spec to support API design similar to what we've provided with the HTTP API. There's been a lot of discussion around Swagger tools and other API and the current 3.1 spec and its limitations. And so maybe the next revision of the Open API spec will help us get to a point where people can just generate tools using the 4.0 specification. And with that, that is the end of our talk. Thank you. Do we have any questions? Oh, yeah, one back here.
All right, thank you for the overview of the HTTP API thing. I was wondering if a user, if you configure this on the server to use HTTP API, does that mean the internal authentication of the iRODS server with itself is also using that, or is that still done using the old system?
That is completely so the HTTP API sits above the iRODS server, so it doesn't actually modify any of the internals within the iRODS server's behavior, right? So it's completely separate. Yeah, it proxies for authentication and things. Any other questions?
Do you have an idea of what's required to go to version 1?
I'm sorry?
Do you have an idea of what is required before you'll call it version 1?
Oh, so my goal is to leverage all of the build numbers and learn as much as we can before we reach version 1. I would love to see more usage of the HTTP API because right now this is meant to be experimental so that we can learn from the community and figure out where the pain points are and figure out how we can address those so that we can build the best interface possible. Because the idea is that eventually this may be packaged with the iRODS server one day and it just ships out the box. And so no one has to compile anything, they just get it for free. And maybe even that becomes a de facto standard for interacting with iRODS servers, right? and interns. Was there another question? Oh, we got some questions from the virtual attendees.
Yeah. So this online question, what was the reason for naming it the HTTP API and the name of the predecessor was REST CPP? That was part one. And then the second question is it possible to configure more than one OpenID in the same configuration?
Okay, so I'll answer the first part and you can talk about it. All right, so as far as why we named it the HTTP API, it's because we did not want to confuse people into thinking that this was designed to be a REST interface. It is not a REST interface because it doesn't, the iRODS API itself, which we wanted to expose in a much simpler, safer way, does not align or map to the REST API design goals well. And so we chose to just scrap any kind of REST, ideas for our next iteration of the HTTP API, and that's primarily the reason.
Good. Okay. So in regards to the OpenID or like OpenID Connect server, OpenID provider question, so what you effectively give is just yeah, that was very nice. You give a URL. You give a URL over to a well-known endpoint, and it just effectively gets all the information of the OpenID provider from there. So I'm not too familiar with OpenID provider configurations, whether or not you can like cluster them and have multiple communicating with each other like that. But in terms of providing what endpoints to hit, I do believe you can only provide one.
All right. All right, if there's other questions, we can address them in Slack, but we're gonna move on to our final talk of the day.